Thank you very much, Jay. Thank you all for coming. It was an extremely generous introduction, and I am still trying to find all the influence that I supposedly had. What I have been given as my mandate today is to discuss the status of Canada politically as we find it now, with a particular emphasis on the resources industries. I hope you will pardon me and not think me pedantic if I give a bit of a historical introduction to this. I think that even in this jurisdiction, which has been afflicted by an inordinate amount of eccentric political activity and electoral results, we can agree, at least amongst us, that the only economic system that works is capitalism, because it is the only one that is aligned with the universal human desire to have more. The idea of sharing is one that appeals to the generous among us when we can afford it, and it can sometimes be used to inspire people in a collective activity, especially in an intense situation or a national emergency like a war. But in general, like Locke's squirrel, all people want more, and there's nothing wrong with that. Now, this is not the greed is good argument. It is the argument that people naturally have to take care of themselves, and there's nothing wrong with them wishing to do that, as long as it doesn't lead to sociopathic activity. As we all know, that though capitalism is the only system that works, it, when completely untrammeled, can lead, and usually does eventually lead, to impetuous activity that endangers the system itself. That, unfortunately, is a fact that is frequently exploited. And again, this is a familiar theme in British Columbia by political elements that wish to interfere in the economic process in a way that's ultimately counterproductive to the goal of wealth creation and adequate and equitable distribution of wealth. But when there is a crisis, whether it is produced by the excesses of capitalism or not, by the nature of things, that crisis falls into the laps of our political leaders, not because they have the slightest aptitude to deal with it, but because the buck stops with the government as it makes the laws, enforces the laws, and controls the money supply. So we have to look at these things through a political lens. In examining the status of Canada, I think we should look at how the concept of a country, of a sovereign national entity, has evolved and how we evolved with it. Originally, countries were cultural entities. In Spain, people spoke Spanish, and in France, they spoke French, and the Dutch spoke Dutch, and the Japanese spoke Japanese, etc. And there were some countries that were intersections, like Switzerland, but in general, they were cultural entities, and their rationale was quite easy to identify. The first serious derogation from that was the United States, which was, of course, the second largest English-speaking country, though it was the most prosperous per capita, even at the time of the Revolution. And it devised, with that ingenuity, that genius for the spectacle and for propaganda that has never deserted the United States, and is indeed, in terms of showmanship of a occasionally somewhat tawdry kind, and certainly an uninhibited kind, personified to a degree by the incumbent president. But the Americans produced a mythos of the birth of freedom, the flame of liberty, a new order of the ages. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That, of course, was a line, very powerful expression, written by a completely unabashed slaveholder. It was a mythos that worked, but it was not without its inconsistencies. But that isn't the point. It worked for America, and since the day of America's founding, the eyes of the world have been upon it. And there has never in the history of the world been anything remotely like the rise of America in just 2 long lifetimes from the Battle of Yorktown to the end of World War II, from a couple of million colonists to half of the economic production of the world, an atomic monopoly, overwhelming military and popular cultural strength, and a range of extremely highly and justly respected leaders, civilian and military. At the end of the war, that was Roosevelt, Truman, General Marshall, General MacArthur, General Eisenhower, Admiral Nimitz, and others, all great men. The status of Canada obviously was rather different. And whoever lived in what is now Canada would be likely to prosper because of the resources of the territory. But making a political entity out of it that would function adequately as a nation had its complexities, as we all know, at least all of us who are Canadians know it. Canada couldn't obviously claim to have a language of its own. It was, depending on how you treat India, the third English-speaking country and the second French-speaking country. And there was, however, if you look at Canadian history carefully, which almost no Canadians do, there was a thread throughout the history of this country, now over 400 years, of a belief in it as a concept. Champlain, the founder of Quebec, believed in it as a French entity. And it had to start as a French entity, because if it had been started, colonized by the British, it would have been assimilated into the American colonies and ultimately into the United States. Now, there are worse fates than being an American. There's nothing wrong with that. But you wouldn't have had a Canada, and that's what we're ostensibly, that's what I've been told I should talk about. And it couldn't stay French, but it had to become self-sufficient so it didn't become a drain. And it was under Jean Talon, who I believe is the precursor of some of our more recent political leaders that the more venerable among you would remember, like C.D. Howe. He started the public sector, private sector cooperation in this country in the 17th century. And indeed, the 1,000 nubile young French girls that he brought out to New France, to Quebec, are the ancestors of more than 7 million French Canadians and Franco-Americans today. But he founded the brewing business, which ultimately became Molson's Brewery. He founded ironmongering, shipbuilding, textiles, and Quebec, as it's now called, was self-sufficient. There was no drain on France. But it had to become British inevitably, because the strategic demarcation in Europe was that France had the largest army, and Britain, being an island, had the largest navy. And so France and other countries were doomed to have overseas possessions that were Britain's leavings. Britain would take what it wanted and leave the rest. So French Canada passed to Britain, but it had to do that approximately at the time that the American colonies ceased to be British, or once again, French Canada would have been assimilated into the United States, and there would have been no Canada in political terms. So the likelihood of those things happening in that sequence exactly was very small if you start at the beginning of it, but that's exactly what did happen. And when the United States declared its independence, it was, as it turned out, just after the British governor in Canada, Sir Guy Carleton, later Lord Dorchester, who was one of the great statesmen we have ever had in this country, seeing the American Revolution coming, and in any case, determining that he rather liked the French Canadians. Even though he was the governor of Canada, he sat for 4 years in London lobbying for the Quebec Act, which he essentially wrote, which assured the French Canadians their cultural and religious and civil liberties in exchange for their loyalty to the British Crown, which is all that got this territory through the American Revolution and basically through the War of 1812 as well. And as we with Canada, while the United States was walking on eggshells dealing with the slavery issue, was gently agitating with the British to have the same rights, the same civic rights for Canadians as citizens of Britain and the United States had, that they could elect their own governments in all matters except defense and foreign affairs. Canada had to keep the military protection of Britain or it would be swallowed by the Americans. But it couldn't agitate Britain so much that the British washed their hands of us and sold us to the Americans for consideration of another kind. This required great skill by Baldwin and LaFontaine and by MacDonald and Cartier, but it's not heroic skill and it's not easily dramatized. It's not give me liberty or give me death, but it was very skillful and very difficult. And the fact that it was apparently unheroic made it in some ways more heroic, I think. But when the United States finally resolved the slavery issue with a dreadful civil war in which 750,000 people died, and it had at the end of it a united country and the greatest army with the greatest generals in the world, and unencumbered by any gratitude to the British for Britain's flirtation with the Confederacy, something, by the way, from which they were dissuaded, they being Palmerston, Gladstone, Russell, and Salisbury, all great British leaders in the 19th century. They were dissuaded by the comparative outsiders, Prince Albert, a German, and Benjamin Disraeli, who ethnically was Jew, who said that Britain could not possibly take a stand on behalf of slaveholding and secessionism, and it would, regardless of the outcome of the US Civil War, lose every interest it had in the Americas. And they prevailed, but they prevailed narrowly. But in any case, the Americans were not full of gratitude for the attitude, the ambiguous attitude they did have. But in those circumstances, John A. Macdonald in particular was able, by an immense act of statesmanship and persuasion, to sell the idea that proved to be the first transcontinental bicultural parliamentary confederation in the history of the world, and it remains so. There's never been another one. And today, that system, which we in Canada take for granted and frequently complain about, and it does have its limitations, but it is the oldest system of political institutions of any country of our population or larger, except those of the British and of the Americans. And it's worked actually quite well. Now, I'm sorry to have mired you in the perhaps at times obscure details of how we got to where we are. But now we're in a world not of mainly nation states, but of nearly 200 countries. And most of them don't function particularly well. And I believe that if it isn't a defined cultural nation, such as the traditional ones which I mentioned, or the unique fact of the United States of America, which has the big brand of the leader of the free countries, democratic countries, and it's earned the brand, and it's had the responsibility of leading the free world, and we must always be grateful and never forget that we owe chiefly to the United States, overwhelmingly to the United States, the comparative triumph of democracy and the free market throughout the world. But it leaves us in Canada as a country that essentially was tossed together as a string of small jurisdictions across the northern border of the United States, composed of people who, for differing reasons, did not wish to be American. The French didn't want to be assimilated into a vast number of English-speaking people, and the English either didn't like the United States or had a monarchical attachment to Britain that was competing loyalty. And ultimately, those, in my opinion, are not reasons that justify a country over a long term, just the desire not to be part of a neighboring country. And I think a country to work well has to have four main elements. It has to have a system that maximizes prosperity and promotes an equitable distribution of that prosperity. And whereas in this country it is a matter of putting regions together, it has to manage regional disagreements or the contention of different regions for different things in an equitable fashion. And all federal and large countries that are democratic know the strains of doing that. We see the problems with Scotland now, and of course the British had terrible problems with Ireland, who finally seceded after centuries. These are difficult problems. They're difficult problems in this country, but they have to be managed. There has to be some community of interest, and ideally, there should be some overarching vision that unites the population. And in my opinion, since we're now getting down to the current condition of this country, I don't think we're managing particularly well in most of those categories now. It is an easy case to make that it is dangerous from a Canadian standpoint to operate higher income, personal and corporate income tax brackets in the United States durably in every bracket, and that's where we are now. The capital flows are obvious. I'm sure most of you are as familiar with them as I am, or more so, as I understand it, and the people that I'll be speaking with when we sit over here in a few minutes know better about it than I do and do surveys about this, but I believe that in the last 5 years, the quantity of foreign capital invested in this country annually has declined by approximately 80%. And the quantity of Canadian capital, or the quantum of it, invested outside Canada has approximately tripled. And we're running a negative capital flow at the moment, I believe, of close to $100 billion a year. Now, that is not sustainable in this country. And we all know it isn't sustainable. But I don't see that in a remotely adequate discussion of the implications of this is taking place. So by the first criterion of guarding the prosperity of the country, assuring its optimal rate of increase and an equitable distribution, by which I do not mean an imposed false Marxist egalitarianism. I mean meritocracy supplemented by reasonable, humane factors to help disadvantaged people. By those standards, I think we are not competitive and not doing well. On the issue of equitable treatment of regional interests, I think we get a stark F. The oppression of Alberta and Saskatchewan in particular is a disgraceful and an outrageous thing. They happen to be energy-producing provinces, and they're being penalized for it, with a minimal attempt to mitigate the penalization. We have had the concurrence of two factors. One should have redounded immensely to our benefit in this country, and the other inevitably has been an inconvenience. One is that the Chinese in particular suddenly determined that economic growth was an objective after the terrible fiascos of the communist regime under Mao Zedong. The Deng Xiaoping government had a 180-degree reverse, of course, and of course, as all the world knows, has generated immense economic growth. This was influential in persuading India to do the same. And with both these countries set on the course of economic growth and putting up impressive economic growth rates and representing nearly 40% of the population of the world, the whole nature, the whole ambience, economic ambience for an economy like Canada's, a natural resource economy, changed radically for the better. I was at one time the largest shareholder of the Noranda Group, which was our second biggest natural resources company after Canadian Pacific at the time. And we never had energy, forest products, and base metals and precious metals all clicking together at the same time. You'd have one up and three down, or the other way around, or something, but never all of them going well. And in base metals, the large importers, the sophisticated industrial importers led by Japan, were constantly bringing new production on stream, even though it was unprofitable, just to keep the commodity price under control. But with the addition of China and India to the ranks of countries seeking economic growth aggressively, the nature of that market changed, and Canada should have been the greatest single beneficiary of it in the world. It has been, as I say, mitigated by the phenomenon of the evolution of the environmental movement. Now, when the environmental movement first became a matter of considerable public attention, it was essentially a series of conservationist groups and specialized groups concerned with different aspects of nature, the preservation and protection of them. And apart from some of the irritating slipovers of Greenpeace into political areas where they didn't belong, like harassing American aircraft carriers when they came to Vancouver and things like that, they were generally benign, well-intentioned, and not particularly irritating groups. And most of what they did was a good thing. However, as it happened with the complete defeat of the international left, the collapse of international communism, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and the severe defeat domestically of the left by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in particular, but to some extent by Helmut Kohl and the Gaullists in France and even Brian Mulroney in this country, the international left landed, not, I think, by brilliant improvisation or strategic design, but initially by coincidence that they quickly realized was fortuitous, on the subject of the environment. And groups of butterfly collectors and bird watchers and people wanting to make sure there were enough wetlands to hunt ducks in and things like this were overwhelmed by the international left, who saw environmental issues as an irresistible and powerful battering ram to attack capitalism with, and that's what they've done. And a great deal of the support of the environmental movement now, as is quite demonstrable, comes from people who are not particularly environmentalists, but are attempting to assault the economic system for what are, strictly speaking, esoteric reasons. You see this very clearly in Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, which incidentally won the Weston Prize for nonfiction. I told Galen Weston that in the first place it was fiction, and in the second place, by giving her a prize, he was proving the wisdom of Lenin's phrase that the capitalists are so stupid they'll sell us the rope we hang them with. He blamed it on his judges. But that is what has happened. And we, as a country, Canada, along with Western Europe, but not the United States, though certainly prominent elements in the United States, but not the present governing majority, and certainly not the East Asians or the Eastern Europeans. Unlike those, but like the Western Europeans, Canada has drunk the Kool-Aid that almost anything that attends economic growth, as we have known, is environmentally irresponsible. And it has made the elaboration of prosperity that people in this rich country would have the right to expect and the duty to demand from their political leaders something that has been somewhat undermined and at times, in fact, repressed by an unrigorous and despotic tyranny of a prejudice based on unproved pseudo-scientific facts. There is not scientific unanimity about climate change. There is not any unanimity at all that it is occurring outside normal cycles, that it is bad, that it is influenced by what people do, or that we know anything about the extent of it if it is happening. And my suggestion in the public policy sphere is that we should devote in this country, since our carbon footprint is 2% of the entire world and is completely irrelevant to the issue anyway in a global sense, we should devote our resources in this area to research, because the temperature of the world hasn't actually changed by more than 1 degree in over a century. And it hasn't got warmer in the first 20 years of this century. And there's terrible disagreement on almost every aspect of how you measure these things. And we're all familiar with the absurdly alarmist statements that the whole range of these people, from charlatans like Al Gore to well-meaning innocents like the Prince of Wales, have made, predicting that we'd all be underwater, or the average temperature of Winnipeg, Manitoba in January be 100 degrees Fahrenheit by now, or something like this. I mean, it hasn't happened, and we don't know what's happening. And so we should devote our resources to research, bona fide, absolutely neutral research, not faked research to try and make a case that we've already become advocates of. In any case, we have to stop the victimization of Alberta, or there is going to be an unsustainable strain to the federal structure of this country. I think that on the matter of a community of interest, we can certainly have that in Canada, and it doesn't have to be based on not wanting to be Americans. It can be based on the positive goal of what I hold out in the book. I mean, it's a pamphlet. You could read it on your way home if you live in the outer suburbs of Vancouver. But the Canadian Manifesto, I put out some ideas, including the way that Canada can become a highly recognized and much emulated country in the world. And the method I suggest is that we become a model of imaginative government. I think the entire advanced world has come to a sort of stasis between the traditional right and left, and there are different ways to do things, and it would put you all to an afternoon nap you might enjoy, but it's not what I've been asked to induce here if I went into the details of these things. But I have suggestions for various fields, and I think we can make Canada really an excellent and much admired political laboratory for sensible public policy. I was invited also to say something about the United States. There's only a slight, the politics of the United States, because as was mentioned, I've known the president for a long time. I will say it very briefly. I just ask you to remember a few things. The 20 years prior to the election of Donald Trump were, I believe, the worst period of presidential misgovernment in the history of the United States. Worse than the 10 years that preceded the Civil War, and worse than the 3 terms between Wilson and Roosevelt. I don't have to recount to you all that went on, the endless wars that delivered most of Iraq to Iran, which was the last possible objective, the humanitarian disasters, the greatest financial crisis since the Great Depression, and so on. And in the 32 years from 1981 to 2013, 8 straight terms, one member or other of the Clinton and Bush families was either president, vice president, or secretary of state. And the public, large part of the public, got the impression that these families were just passing these great offices back and forth. It was time for a change. In the matter of the president himself, it should be remembered that in making billions of dollars in a difficult business in one of the toughest cities in the world, and in transforming himself overnight into a television star who, with a program he designed himself, pulled from 5 to 25 million viewers a week for 14 years, and in devising a system for taking the headship of the government by branding his name in most extraordinarily broad ways, and as a wrestling impresario, and on mineral water bottles and mattresses and shirts and ties and all manner of things, as well as buildings, and appearing endlessly on television and giving inspirational speeches everywhere, and these hucksterism schemes of his, like his so-called university. With all of this, and going to social media to end run the national political media, and changing parties 7 times in 13 years, he kept closing in on his goal of being president, and he did achieve it. And in doing all of those things before he was inaugurated, I put it to you that he accomplished more in his prior career, not necessarily in the most tasteful manner of all of his predecessors, but more than all of them, except those who were instrumental in founding the country: Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, and those who led great armies victoriously in just wars, Grant and Eisenhower, and possibly Herbert Hoover for his relief work in Europe at the end of World War I. And as president, his weaknesses for what he calls constructive hyperbole are well known, and he does do things that grate on my nerves, as they do, I'm sure, on yours. But the facts are, in terms of doing as president what he said as a candidate for that office he would do, he has fulfilled his promises better than anyone in my time, and I go back to Eisenhower. And most of those were good presidents. And the fact is, in abolishing unemployment for the time being, making the US an energy exporter, reducing illegal immigration by 80%, reviving the concept of nuclear non-proliferation with North Korea and Iran, and facing up to the challenge of China, recognizing it as a challenge and saying that he wants productive and positive relations with China, but it is a rival, and he will not tolerate the United States having its pocket picked anymore. And in sparing the country the insufferable burdens of the Green Terror and removing himself from the Paris Agreement, which was rivaled only by the Iran nuclear agreement, is the stupidest the United States ever entered, in my opinion. In all of that, he's achieved a great deal, and I think he's had the most successful first term of any president except Lincoln, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Richard Nixon. On that note, my time is up, and I subside. Thank you.